Books 7 through 12 are really the heart of the Odyssey in more ways than just structurally in the middle of the narrative. Books 7 through 12 are where we get to hear some of the most grand adventures of Odysseus from his own mouth. At least 9 through 12 we get to hear from his own perspective. What you see in front of you is a map of the ways that the Greeks conceived of the world. The world was round but surrounded by the river ocean, and the river ocean is what held everything in its bounds. And we get to see the journey. Look at where Troy is on the map, and then of course all his journeys so far from home. So it looks as though he could have actually walked over the mountains faster than he was able to sail past those islands, and ended up so far from home in places that no one has actually ever been to. Most of the journeys that Odysseus records, we don't have a place on an actual map for them, other than Hades, where all the Greeks knew where Hades was, that Hades was a real place underground, under the world. The rest of the locations are not places, or majority of the locations, except for maybe the first one, are not places that occur on an actual map. When we get into the underworld, we will get to see Odysseus talk to Hercules about his labors. And we know that there were 12 labors, in the same way that there are also 12 labors undertaken by Odysseus. He has 12 different tasks that he undertakes, 12 different adventures that he goes through in the course of the narrative as he recounts it. At the close of Book 6, Odysseus has run into Nausicaa, who has given him instructions about how to approach the palace of her parents and how to throw himself at the knees of Queen Arete. Arete, of course, meaning virtue, and that this will be a beloved queen who can help him get back home. We do not yet hear of the adventures of Odysseus, but we know that they have caused him great pain and much suffering. When Calypso offered for him to stay there and said, "You will be glutted of suffering," Odysseus tells us, "I've already suffered so much. I don't think a little more suffering is going to hurt anybody." So we see a man who is at his breaking point. It has been years and years of suffering. When he approaches the queen, he actually tells her, "I have been gone so long, it hurts. Help me to get back to my family, and quickly." It's a moving speech. They don't know who he is, but they can see the pain, they can see the hurt. And rather than ask him his identity right away, they instead offer him a bath, rest, and agree that they will have these conversations about who he is the next day. There's an interesting pairing when we get to see Odysseus sleeping, isolated and alone, but he is restful after all these adventures, contrasted with Alcinous, sleeping in the next room with his wife, who made their bed and shared it. And we know that that is the nostos, that is the homecoming that Odysseus longs for. So at the end of book 7, we are waiting for that fulfillment. We still know that it is going to be a long journey ahead before he's able to sleep next to Penelope, who made their bed and shares it. Book 8 is one of the most famous in all of Homer, including the Iliad, because it gives us our model for Homer, possibly himself, as the blind poet. We have Demodocus, who is described as one to whom the muse has given two gifts, the one of blindness and the one of poetry or song. So the gift of blindness is described as bad, and yet it's also described as a gift. In some ways, we see that he has a gift of second sight, that he sees more than with his eyes. He sees something greater. He has this ability for poetry because he has this gift of second vision, and that becomes the model we have for Homer himself. Demodocus sings of the famous stories whose kleos has touched the sky. This will be a line that is repeated 2 or 3 times. Odysseus himself will introduce himself in Book 9 as the one whose kleos has reached the sky. He is also going to describe his wife Penelope later as whose fame has touched the sky. And Agamemnon is going to describe Penelope in Book 24 as one whose kleos has touched the sky. So we're getting to hear about these famous stories in the same way that we have Achilles describing the songs, the glorious deeds of men when he's sitting on the beach in Book 8 of the Iliad. We see Odysseus treating the bard to the greatest cut of boar fat here that he offers, and he asks that the poet give him then a song, a great song about what the Greeks suffered at Troy. He is setting up his own introduction. What we will hear about in books 9 through 12 is all the different ways that Odysseus has not had great xenia, that people have not treated him like a guest. Therefore, he's very mistrustful even of the great gifts of these Phoenicians, even as they have brought him in. He is still waiting for the right way to introduce himself. He can't just throw his name out there. He's been gone for 10 years. Troy happened 10 years ago. They may not know who he is. He could say, I'm Odysseus, and they say, yeah? Who's Odysseus? If he asks Demodocus to sing the story of the fall of Troy, and Demodocus, though, sings about Odysseus, then Odysseus will be able to introduce himself. He will know that he too has kleos that has touched the sky. Elizabeth Van Diver makes this point very clear in her course on the Odyssey, that the reasons that Odysseus actually asks Demodocus to sing this song is so that he might know whether these people would have ever heard of him and how then to introduce himself to them. Is he the city sacker? Is he the one that is as famous as he had hoped to be by this point? This is in great contrast to Achilles, of course, who would have a name that lives forever. Everyone's going to know Achilles. It was fated to him that if he died at Troy, everyone would know him. And yet we will see him in the underworld unhappy that he chose the short life and long-living fame. Here we have a man who's going to live long, Odysseus, and who's going to have great fame, as he'll get to hear in the song of Demodocus. Demodocus sings the story of the Trojan horse. It was first mentioned to us, this wooden horse, by Menelaus and Helen, when they recounted how it was that Odysseus snuck in. And Helen mentioned that Odysseus had dressed up like a beggar first to undertake a spy expedition in order to see what was going on and to see how they could get into the city of Troy. And of course, she saw right through his disguise. But the wooden horse has not been explained all the way. So here we get to hear from Demodocus about the story of the Trojan horse that was designed by Odysseus and dragged into the citadel. And the bard sings of this and how Odysseus brought in the men inside the horse and how they wanted to decide whether to strike right now with the swords or whether or not they should leave the horse outside of the town. What should they do with it? And as they bring it in, they bring in their downfall. They bring in their doom. Demodocus describes Odysseus like Ares, and he says alongside Menelaus, they jump from the horse and bring dreadful violence to the city of Troy. At this point, Odysseus melts into tears. I want to look closely at this beautiful metaphor that we have here, the way that Odysseus' tears are described here as he is weeping in public. And this is not the first time that he has wept in front of the Phaeacians. He has wept earlier when Demodocus has sung as well about the deeds of Troy, about the fight between Achilles, and he is almost showing his hand several times before this moment by crying at these songs of Troy. And so the Phaeacians have probably uncovered that he was a soldier from Troy, but they don't really know the extent of it. They don't know exactly who he is. When he is melting in tears here, it is described with the same kind of desperation or suffering that we can imagine Andromache went through when Troy was sacked. If you remember, Andromache was Hector's wife, Hector knew that if he died, Andromache would be taken away in slavery by the Greeks, that she would be tortured, that she would be made fun of for being Hector's wife. And here we have the description of Odysseus sacking Troy by Demodocus' song, and yet Odysseus is weeping like a woman who is being beaten and taken out of her city and into slavery. So we have some sort of pathos here that Odysseus is identifying more with the victims of his own sacking of Troy and crying in such a way that they too would have cried. There's a lot to be read into this passage and a lot to be asked about why he is described crying this way and what Homer was hoping to achieve by describing him this way. It's a beautiful metaphor that really does not allow, again, in the same way that the Iliad never allowed us to see the good guys and bad guys, never Trojans versus Greeks as one side or the other, but really melts those things into one another. Book 9 through 12 are told from Odysseus's perspective. Odysseus tells us who he is. He is described in the last time that Homer will break into the narrative with wily Odysseus, the Lord of Lies. We are not sure exactly how Homer sung the Odyssey. A lot of people think that the Iliad and the Odyssey were sung over 3 days. If so, then likely this would have been the beginning of a new day, as Odysseus tells his own story from his own perspective. We would have ended potentially on book 8 on day 1, and we would have seen that the Homer would have received the greatest cut of meat, right? So when Odysseus hands that great cut of meat to Demodocus and says that poets are gifts from the muses, that they are gifts from the gods, that we should respect them, that poets are the most respected of all people, we can almost hear Homer asking for his dinner, asking to be the most respected among those at the festival. And then the next day, the story begins with Odysseus himself. What we have to catch is that Odysseus is the Lord of Liars as he begins the story. We have a very untrustworthy narrator who's beginning this story. I am Odysseus, son of Laertes, the most wily, the most cunning, the one whose Kleos reaches the skies. And then he begins his stories of his 12 different adventures. So he has an agenda here. As we have seen, he has been able to craft his narrative to fit his audience. He has crafted his narrative with Calypso for how to leave her island, get his raft, and not insult the goddess. He has crafted his narrative when he was speaking with Nausicaa. He has been able to use rhetoric to his own agenda. She is a young girl, she's alone. How can I speak to her that makes her want a husband but not want me, etc. Now we have Odysseus in his element. He has set it up. The Demodocus has sung about the deeds of Odysseus in his song about the Trojan horse, and he gets to step up and now tell his own story. Eva Brann points out that in a large way, Odysseus actually steals the thunder from Demodocus from this point forward. If you can actually imagine the scene taking place chronologically, Odysseus is standing and then saying, I'm now going to sing the rest of the songs for the rest of the evening. And his songs shock his audience. His songs have his audience hanging on every word. They have never heard anything like this before. So Odysseus begins his narrative. It's from his perspective. What then does this mean for how we understand the adventures of Odysseus? To draw on Eva Brann, who was a professor at St. John's who taught for 50 years the Iliad and the Odyssey, I think we need to look at some of the things that she points out about Odysseus himself as the narrative teller of books 9 through 12. Homer composes the Odyssey, but Odysseus tells the lowercase Odyssey. To ask how Homer knows the Odyssey is to drive the question concerning the origins of poetry to dizzying extremes. What she means here, of course, is unlike the Iliad, in which we were constantly questioning when did Troy fall, How did we have these stories passed down person after person about the fall of Troy and all of the details and the different heroes? And can we find records of a real Alexandros and records of a real Hector? And where do we see these narratives and how do they line up with the myths of Homer? Of course, we would want to cut the myths about the gods from the narrative in order to make it more realistic. When we get to the Odyssey, we have lost our ability to understand how Homer would know this narrative. Odysseus tells it here, and then the Phaeacians, as we'll see later, will be cut off from civilization, unable to share this narrative with anyone. Odysseus then tells the story again to Penelope, but who would Penelope have told this story to? There's also no other witnesses of this account other than Menelaus knowing about Calypso. So we have Homer composing a narrative in Odysseus's perspective in which we don't have any ways of knowing how true this narrative is, whether it's true, what's true about it. And so we have to imagine that truth is truer than empirical fact. We have to jump into a world of imagination in which it's not about the history of events. It is more about the myths themselves and what they tell us about Odysseus, what they tell us about the world, and what they tell us about ourselves as human beings. Odysseus himself never calls on the Muses. As we got to see in the opening of the Odyssey and in the opening of the Iliad, sing Muse. We have an imperative command given by Homer the poet. Sing Muse, inspire my tale, tell me where to begin, tell me how to start my story. Whereas what we saw from Odysseus, he is asking, where do I start? Where can I end? Okay, first I'm going to tell my name. Who is he asking this to? Where shall I start and where can I end? In a sense, he is talking to himself. He is not talking to any one of us about where he can start and where he can end. He's not talking to the Muses. He does not call on them for his story. This is his story. As Eva Brann points out, it's his private narrative. It's his private secret. All of the men that he experienced this story with, they all die by the time that he gets to Calypso's island. So there are no eyewitnesses to this story. How each of them die is recorded to him, and most of them are not given names. We're only hear about 2 or 3 of his sailors by name. The rest of them are all the nameless soldiers that he brings with him in this narrative. Eva Brann also points out when Odysseus tells this and to whom. He tells the story to the Phaeacians. The Phaeacians in Greek, the Phaeakes, sounds, even though it doesn't have the same etymology, sounds like phainein, to bring to light, from whence comes fantasia, fantasy, imagination. So he is telling a work of the imagination to the place of the imagination. She also notes that Odysseus coins the words mythologian here, which means to give an account in a story form. So we really are exiting the world of empirical fact, of geographical places, of a realistic timeline, and we are now entering the world of myth and imagination, where the facts do not matter near as much as what the story is trying to tell you the truth about.